Good morning. So we're here to talk about creating a sustainable open source ecosystem that works for all the myriad projects, the people, and the lots and lots and lots of interests that they support. My name is Jory Burson. I am with the JS Foundation. I'm also the COO of Bocoup LLC. With me today is Erin McKean. She is a developer advocate at IBM. She's also the founder of Broadening and lover of APIs and many a Twitter bot. We have Tracy Hinds, a very accomplished engineer in her own right, but has now changed her focus to supporting the social aspects of coding and is supporting Node Foundation's education and community initiatives. And then we have Maggie, Pint, engineering lead at Microsoft, maintainer of Moment.js and representative for the JS Foundation on TC39. So anyway, we know that creating an open and successful ecosystem requires looking at the problem space from a lot of different angles. You have economic concerns, political concerns, cultural concerns, historical concerns, a lot of different ways to look at the problem. And so I want to start this morning by talking about the economic side of it. We're seeing a lot more funding. Funding open source is a hot topic these days, but we're also hearing from maintainers that they don't know exactly, how to spend all the funds in their open collective accounts, for example. So, really, what resources do we need from an economics perspective to support our open source projects? Maggie, you want to start?
Sure. So definitely, this is something that the Moment team, we've struggled a lot with. Getting a long list of requests, especially around, modularize the library, make it immutable, things like that. And what we've found is that more than anything, we're really out of time. Ultimately, for my day job, I work as a SRE for Azure, which is not exactly the same thing as being Moment.js's full-time maintainer, and everybody on our team is like that. So, we've talked a lot about like money and what would money do for us, and money is really good for some things. Like we really needed a better standard library for date in JavaScript. And for that reason, we were able to approach JS Foundation and say, hey, can we get some funding to send me to TC39 to like get that done? And so that's a place where we needed money. But for the most part, money to pay developers, like, it doesn't help us much. Like, it would take a heck of a lot of money for me to be able to quit my job at Microsoft and full-time make Moment.js immutable and fully modularized. So it's one of those things where more than anything, we need a little give from employers to give us some time to fold our libraries into our day-to-day life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we were also talking, I think last week at the TC39 meeting about, some of the other challenges that monetary donations to, for example, an open collective account creates.
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing is, what do you do with it? I mean, occasionally we can maybe fly together for a face-to-face meeting, which would be cool, but the maintainers team aren't the only contributors to Moment. I mean, believe it or not, like we get more outside contributions, like more code has been written by people off the maintainers team than on it. So like you start getting money coming in and you're like, well, who the heck do I pay? Do I pay myself because I'm on the maintainers team, or do I pay someone who's made a significant contribution? Once you split it up across every contributor, everybody's getting $10. Woo.
Accountancy is not really a draw into open source.
Accountants are not developers necessarily.
I'm just saying nobody goes into open source software because they really want to do accounting.
Yeah, probably not. Tracy, how are you seeing money make a difference on the community side and the education side?
Yeah, it's funny. We something that we have to think about, I think, as a community, and it's in JavaScript as well as Node, is sort of what's the strategy? Mm-hmm. Like if you're going to be putting money towards things, you have to be really deliberate in how you're doing it because, otherwise you're splitting it $10 between all of your maintainers and contributors. And so it's sort of like, whether the money is going to help create more sustainable community events or whether it's to, I think the thing that I appreciate most about being able to have a budget, is being able to figure that out from, events bring people together and provide opportunities for interaction that can continue online. And we are a global project, so we have to not only do that as a means to solving our problems, but being able to do things like provide travel for members of the community to go to TC39, or Collaboration Summit, or other events that are relevant to the project are really powerful in being able to work in all the different ways that we are dependent on as a project, but also collaborating. Yeah, it's such a big challenge, but I think that those are especially powerful ways to be able to spend that money.
Yeah, so strategically using the monetary resources to maximize impact for the entire community. That's, yeah. So we're also seeing a lot more open source contributions from corporations. We're seeing a lot of activity in that space, and I'm curious how that's changing the landscape now that we have more companies seeing the value, a lot of companies here, a lot of companies who aren't here today, seeing the value of open source. How is that changing, the landscape of the contributors and the landscape for maintainers?
Well, I think it's also, in part, a really good recruiting strategy on the part of companies. Like, I've been with IBM about a year, and part of the draw of joining IBM was that I could work on loopback and also with the Open API initiative. And that's really attractive. And it helps people have better work-life balance if you know that you're going to be able to spend some of your work time on projects that really motivate you. And also, it gives, as we've just seen with Equifax, just using open source doesn't necessarily mean that you're using open source well, and having people actually involved with the projects it gives corporations a little bit more, maybe a better feeling that their employees actually know what's going on.
I think at Microsoft, one thing that I've been working on lately is, this is something I was really excited to do. My full division is called Production Infrastructure Engineering, and we have our SREs, and we have things like our monitoring tools and our build deploy tools and things like that in our division. And as Microsoft, we're such a big company that we have a lot of trouble collaborating, right? We have a lot of trouble making sure that every team knows what every other team is doing and like trying to prevent code overlap. It's hard because we're so big. And one thing that I've been working on lately is actually educating our engineers within production infrastructure on open source development methodology. So the corporation looked at what the open source community was doing, especially like Node, what an amazing project where so many people can come to the table and get their opinion in, and said, okay, how do we pick up those development methodologies and apply them to what we're doing over here in our internal engineering teams? How do we teach people to kind of reach out and embrace that open source mentality where when someone needs something or someone wants to contribute something, you aren't like throwing it on the back of a backlog and saying, yeah, that's great. You're saying, how do I get you in? And how do I say yes to you, and how do I help you become a part of my world? So definitely corporations see the advantage there. This was a direct ask from my CVP to help us figure out how to do a little bit better open source development methodologies, even on tools that aren't open source.
So they're really deriving a lot of benefit from the community, and we were talking earlier just about the resources needed. Money may or may not be a need, but what can companies do to really support this resource that they are getting so much from?
Provide time. So it's, money is a thing, but time is really important, right? We're constantly looking for people to help support our projects and contribute time, and being able to provide some sense of structure to that, right? You have the nebulous idea of the 20% time if a company is generous enough to provide that in a codified way as part of your job description. But actually making sure that your employees have those boundaries set and time each week and time each month to be able to contribute to that, and make sure that others in the company understand the value of that, so that they're being encouraged to do that instead of guilted into it being pushed into their spare time.
Or additional work that they have to do on
Yeah.
top of that.
110%.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Giving that time kind of opens the door a little bit wider for diversity and inclusion, right? If the only people who can work on open source are the people who can do it nights and weekends, who don't have any family obligations, who don't have other hobbies that help them maintain balance, then you get a monoculture. But being able to go in on Friday mornings and say, hey, it's Open Source Friday, and being able to do that across the org. So not just developers, but say, people in marketing get to contribute to open source marketing, people in technical writing get to contribute to open source technical writing. That's really important too.
I think permission to contribute is a huge thing where I just a week ago gave a presentation in front of my org again because we're kicking off this whole open source thing where I went up there and I was like, you have permission to contribute to open source. You should do that. That would be great. And it's funny because I got a whole bunch of people who had never locked into the idea that they could even contribute, especially we're over in the kind of DevOpsy world and we have people who are like, well, I can write a PowerShell script kind of. That's all I can do. And I'm like, that doesn't prevent you from contributing. If you're using Jenkins, even if you can only write a PowerShell script, you can definitely contribute to their documentation. You can definitely contribute to best practices manuals. You can definitely contribute to things like that. And I think people, until they hear that permission, until you go in front of them and say, look, you can, and in fact, we would like you to contribute to open source, they don't think that's for them. I can definitely say when I first got into open source, I didn't think it was for me. I, at the time, worked at this little tiny software company in Minnesota, great company actually, that made HR software. And nobody's ever heard of us. It's called TempWorks. It's a great company, but you've probably never heard of it. And I was this engineer, and I was no, cool people do open source. Cool people work on big libraries and do standards committees, and why would I have permission to do that? And one of the other moment maintainers was well, you've worked a lot in the datetime space, right? HR software, you know about time and time zones and stuff. I was yeah. And he's well, I think you should maybe contribute to Moment. And I was well, I've been kind of looking for something else to do. But until someone gives you that permission, you tend to hold yourself back.
I think you're spot on. The permission is very powerful, and also the ask is very powerful. Being asked to contribute is really. Do you have stories to share from being asked? I mean, nah, it's all right.
I definitely do from the community side. I mean,
Yeah.
that's sort of my genesis with Node is that I was a JavaScript engineer and looking for something to do outside of my day job of being a junior engineer and feeling really useless and burdensome. And I went to the first Node event in Portland, and Ben Acker was just you have all these ideas, you should help out. And that was really nice because I felt useful. And even if it was just in the I can be friendly with other developers and we can all learn together and provide opportunities for that. And that made the space for me to have that JavaScript engineer by day and conference organizer as a hobby by night. And that's how I got to be where I'm at now, was sort of being able to help in both spaces eventually.
Yeah. I think you're also kind of touching on something that Maggie was saying earlier. It's not just developers that we need to support the open source community, but other things as well. Community organizing, project management, that kind of thing. When you think about our whole ecosystem, in addition to code, what else do we need?
Sticker design, very important.
It is.
Very important.
Oh my God.
Top of the list.
Well, that's what in Node we have, so with the community committee, this is a huge challenge for us this year, is that we established, we're trying to do outreach for all of the different parts of the ecosystem that need a voice. And part of that is education. It is evangelism and outreach. It is the getting started. And a lot of that, so that in itself is not a lot of code. And so it takes a lot of people from project management. We could use project management, so many people could help with us with that in various parts of the project. And I think that that's something Gregor Martinez has been really awesome in trying to push forward, was the idea that these types of roles are essential, and they just don't exist right now because the folks who do this work aren't really accustomed to being in that space in open source.
And they need permission.
Yeah,
and to be
absolutely.
asked. So, you know, we've also heard a lot today about, you know, creating diverse and inclusive communities within open source, and I think this is also an opportunity. Bringing in other kinds of support is an opportunity to do that. Thoughts?
Well, I think of diversity and inclusion, I think inclusion gets a short shrift. Like if you bring in 1,000 people and 999 of them leave because they don't feel that their contribution is valued, or they have people making them feel like they don't belong there, then that's just a waste of everybody's time. And those 999 people are not going to be super excited to go to a different project, because if they only have experience with one project, they're going to feel like, oh, open source is like this everywhere. And I think we could do better with mentoring, like, you know, having friends take a look at your pull requests or what you've written to give feedback and guidance about maybe what the unspoken, unwritten norms are in a community, and then giving help in pushing those norms to be more inclusive when they aren't. That would go a long way. Just dropping people in the middle of a project who come from backgrounds where they haven't been given that kind of contextual information and expecting them to behave just like everybody else who's already on the project, that's not really a recipe for success. And that's not really kind, you know? And open source should be joyful, in my opinion, right? Like, sometimes writing that kind of code, building a project that a lot of people use is joyful. And to take that away from people is like the worst thing we could do.
I think one interesting story about diversity and inclusion can be told around TC39. There have long been accusations that TC39 was not inclusive and not diverse, and they're probably quite fair in a lot of ways. And I was one of the first women to ever go to TC39. There are a few others even in this room who have been there. I was one of the first women to ever present. And the interesting thing about that is that it can sound like my accomplishment, but at the end of the day, it really wasn't. That accomplishment to evolve that committee can really more be credited to the committee itself. There was a certain subset of people on that committee who said, I think that this makeup isn't the makeup that we need to have the full spectrum of views that we need to have. And I'll call out a few specific people who were huge in this. Leo Balter fought really hard to get a code of conduct on TC39. Brian Charleston found me and said, I think you should come. But in any case, they fought really hard to say, this isn't who we want to be. We want to be a more diverse community. And they got the code of conduct out and they put it in front of each other and they talked about, like, how do we do this and how do we do this right? So a lot of times, a huge part of diversity and inclusion is not just like dropping in diverse people, but finding it in yourself to say, at one point, I was acting in this way or behaving in this way, and at this point, I would like things to be different. And at the end of the day, by the time that I and some of the other women who have now been attending, and we do still lack for people of color, I'll be honest about that. By the time we showed up, it was like the committee had made itself ready for us. It had made itself ready for us to come and be a part of it. I won't say that it's perfection. Nothing in life is perfection. But I think one of the best things we can do to encourage diversity and inclusion in the ecosystem is to make ourselves ready for that. To ask ourselves, are we setting this up in the way that it needs to be set up? And to call it important, to kind of pick up that torch and say, we're going to make this happen.
Yeah, I think that that's something that's really beautiful about that story in particular is it's the underlying, like, why do we need diversity? Why do we need inclusion? And it's the perspectives. That's the point, right? It's if we're out to build this thing and we're missing the people in the room and in the seats that are supposed to be like giving us the full comprehensive perspective that we need in order to build good software and build good projects, then fix it. But as part of that, you have to invite people and make sure that they understand that they can speak when they're in the room.
I will state on the record that while I am one of few women who attends TC39 regularly, the primary diversity of perspective that I bring is as an enterprise software developer. It's not about being female. What the heck does that experience have to do with it? The primary diversity of perspective is that the vast majority of that committee is into language design, engine implementation. There are a couple other enterprise software developers, but believe it or not, the diversity that I bring isn't really around being a woman. It's around having made some HR software for years and now making DevOps software. That's different more than anything.
And we know that JavaScript developers are capable of change because look how often we switch frameworks.
Right. Okay. But actually we are talking about change management, right? Like, it's essentially, right? An organization like TC39 decided to take it on themselves to change their behavior, change their pattern, and adopt a more inclusive policy. But that's and adopt a code of conduct. But we're talking about things that JavaScript developers are and are not. You know, they maybe are not also, you know, experienced with that kind of change, experienced with the, you know, HR kind of related issues that arise from change. You know, and so the burden often falls back on the maintainers or the project leads. Like, you know, what are some of the things that, you know, we need to do or we could do to support maintainers who are trying to make big changes?
Yell at them less.
Yell at them less.
Like, you know, I feel like if you're asking a maintainer for something, you should just read what you've written and then go back and put in a lot of pleases and thank yous. Like the number of terse requests that maintainers seem to see just by looking at people's GitHub issues, it's like you've just written one terse request, but the maintainer is seeing tens, dozens, hundreds of them, and that piles on. Nobody likes to get yelled at all day and all night if they're working on it at night.
Yeah, that's a good point. I met someone at a meetup in New York, and they were really stoked that I was working in Node. And he was like, yeah, I went up to Ryan Dahl. I saw him at a conference, and I was so excited because I wanted to thank him for Node. That's all I wanted to do. And he went up there, and Ryan was very shy and didn't end up really speaking with him. And he was like, yeah, you know, he wasn't really like very, very talkative. And I was like, well, you know, to be fair, I have also witnessed on a fairly regular basis somebody going up to Ryan Dahl and trying to cuss him out for Node. And so it was like this is just like, unfortunately, for every person who wants to say thank you, there are so many more who just want to walk up to a person they don't know and say, oh, you work on this project, let me tell you about the 1,000 things I need you to fix personally. And so I think, yeah, figuring out how to roll that back a little bit and one, you know, be thankful to the maintainers who have put so many hours in, and also like get to the point where we have a nicer dialogue so that the maintainers don't feel burnt out and bitter and can instead empower the people who come up to them and say like, oh yeah, I found this bug. And we're like, cool, let me show you how you can help me fix it.
For what it's worth, I think the internet allows us, or somehow gives us permission, or we feel it gives us permission to engage in behaviors that we shouldn't engage in. Because for me personally, anytime I show up to an event like this and I say, well, I'm on the Moment.js core team, people are like, yes, I love that library. Fix those days. And yet, when you get on the internet, it's just like between Twitter and GitHub, it's a never-ending barrage of complaint. Like the likelihood that I see someone happy on the internet is very, very low. So it's interesting because in person, people will, you know, say rude things in person, but for the most part, what happens is that in person, people are like, oh, that's a good thing, and then for some reason, the internet like gives us this permission to like spew all of our complaints and negativity out, and like people are hearing them. Like, we're not faceless, nameless. Like, I'm hearing every one of your complaints. I'm reading every one of your complaints. I'm trying to absorb and work into the schedule and work into everything else, every one of your complaints. And so I think being mindful of the fact that the internet gives us this weird permission to be slightly rude, and remember that, like, you are talking to a real person on the other end, even though it's through a computer, is really important for the ecosystem. That's what helps us as maintainers, not just burnout. When every once in a while we get a polite response or a really good pull request, that's what gets us up and going the next day.
I just don't understand why people don't realize that they get more merges with honey than with vinegar. Like, just seems like common sense to me.
Well, to be clear, we don't mind criticism. Like, yes, the library is too big. Yes, it should be immutable. Yes, it should be properly modularized. Yep. We don't mind the criticism. We understand where the community need is. It's just that the kind of constants to it gets rough.
You're kind of caught in the middle, right? In a way, you're kind of the open source middle management, right? Where you've got the users who are saying, hey, I need these changes yesterday, and but you've got also pressures from all sides.
I mean, the hard thing with really popular libraries, I know a few other major open source library maintainers are here, so they'll know this, is that you get this critical mass where, like, we've been saying for a year that we're going to ship immutable moment.js. We have like a branch for the test build, but at the end of the day, change anything, like change any behavior whatsoever, anything. And someone's coming at you going, my unit tests are broken, why did you ruin my day? And so it's really difficult to move. It's really difficult to create velocity under critical mass. And more than anything, the way out of that is really to have the community rallying around not just code. Frankly, we can handle the code, but around things like documentation, helping us through the alpha releases, writing blog posts about what's coming next. Because we need to get everyone ready. Like, it's hilarious. We have an immutable moment.js branch that has built for 3 months, and we're like, we don't know how to merge this. Like, we have to rewrite all of our documentation. We have to get comms out. We have to make sure that there's an alpha release. And, like, it's hard to get around that critical mass.
A lot of non-coding tasks that need to be done.
Which goes back to that. Like, if you're a PM or a content writer or in marketing, like, you can really help an open source project.
We're asking you to do that right now.
Yeah.
Giving you permission.
Yes.
So much permission. All the permission.
Yeah, I think we were actually talking about this yesterday. I think I was talking with Gaurav Seth about this, with sort of even just when you're talking about something like, a library or all of these projects that people are contributing to, communication is so important, and that helps manage expectations, right? So if you are able to write a roadmap out and be able to stick to it and share all of the things that you're having to put into it in order to get it shipped, I feel like to a certain extent you can at least point to that and say, we hear you, it's just this far down on the list of priorities. So like, we absolutely want to get to this and we totally agree with you, but like, can you help us get there?
I think another thing to remember is that projects have life cycles. And right now, like with Moment, I voiced all of the complaints and the things that we hear. Our priority one is to end our library. That's why I'm on a plane every other month to parts unknown to get a new standard date library in JavaScript. Because at the end of the day, you have to be mindful of like, where does this project need to go in spite of community demands, like what actually solves these problems and makes something better. And like for us, our priority one is like, let's get a standard date library in JavaScript. So being mindful of what actually serves people best and putting your effort there is really important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a lot of different factors contributing to the health of an ecosystem. I'm not sure if we have all of the answers today, but one thing that we did clearly identify, I think, is just the burden and the stress that often falls on project maintainers and leads. And so we could probably talk about that all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time today, but tomorrow afternoon about 3:20, if you'd like to join us for a session to address in small group format how to reduce maintainer burden, maybe do a little group therapy. We'd love to see you there at that session. But thank you all for the panel today and the discussion, and thanks for coming to Node. Thank you.